You might think this is just another small-town ghost story, but I'm here to tell you it's far more than that. Please note that the exact names of locations as well as specific plants and individuals have been changed for privacy and narrative flow. It was the early 1990s when my family packed up our lives and moved to the Oklahoma Panhandle. I'd been laid off from my job in Kansas City, and the economy there offered me few options. With 2 young daughters, I had to support my family. My wife, Cheryl, mentioned that a cousin of hers said a meatpacking plant in the town of Guyman was hiring. We were so desperate that this opportunity felt like a lifeline. We found a decent 2-story rental on the outskirts of town. 3 bedrooms, faded 70s wallpaper, and creaky floorboards that announced every midnight trip to the bathroom. My daughters, Melissa, 8, and Jenny, 6, shared a room upstairs with a window overlooking the backyard. Back then, moving was still an adventure, not a trauma, thankfully. On the day we arrived, our neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, came over, casserole in hand, and warned us about the August heat. Fanning herself on our porch, she commented we'd picked a hell of a time to move to the Panhandle. She added that come winter, when the wind rolled down and froze everything it touched, we'd have a hard adjustment. The Westland meat plant was a short drive from our house. The building was enormous. Imagine corrugated steel, concrete, and industrial efficiency, isolated in a flat landscape like a fortress built for butchers. On my first day, the plant manager, I'll call him DJ, gave me a tour. He shouted over the clanking machinery, proudly boasting that they processed about 16,000 hogs a day, almost as if he were talking about his own children's accomplishments. He explained I'd be working on the disassembly floor, my hourly wage about $11, overtime almost every week, and health insurance kicking in after 90 days. The work was brutal. I'd done physical labor before, but nothing like this relentless, repetitive, strenuous grind. After every shift, my shoulders and back screamed in protest. But the smell, that was something else entirely. It permeated everything: clothes, skin, hair, even my nostrils. It was a mix of blood, terrible disinfectant, and something I couldn't quite place, maybe just the meat itself. Almost every night, I came home smelling of it. My daughters found it disgusting and hilarious. Jenny would shriek that, "Daddy smells like rotten hot dogs," dramatically holding her nose, while Melissa would burst into peals of laughter. Cheryl was less amused, daily instructing me to strip in the garage, throw my clothes directly into the washer, and shower before I touched anything. Despite all the unpleasantness, I was happy because we were going to make it. The pay was good and reliable. We could pay our bills, and the girls were settling into their new school well. But you can't work in a plant like Westland without hearing stories. In the break room, during smoke breaks, in the locker room, anywhere the men gathered, there were stories. Much of it was typical office gossip. Rumors of affairs between shift supervisors and workers, who was a kleptomaniac and which boss was a pushover. It wasn't long before I heard one story that kept popping up in various forms. I first heard it from Mickey, who'd worked at Westland for 15 years and was just one station down from me. We were on lunch break when he nudged me and pointed toward an older section of the plant visible through the break room window. Between bites, he mentioned that section used to be the main disassembly floor back in the 70s, the place where old Harold Vance bought it. I asked what he meant by bought it, as the phrase was new to me. Mickey looked at me like I was dumb and explained bought it meant he died. He lowered his voice, telling me it happened around 1976 or 77. Harold Vance was about 60 and had worked there most of his life. Legend had it, Harold had stumbled and fallen into one of the grinding mills, with only his left boot left behind. I cringed. That kind of thing grossed me out. I commented it sounded terrible. Mickey added it got worse. Some folks believed Harold didn't just stumble. He was pushed by some other man who was allegedly having an affair with Harold's wife. It was absurd. I remember thinking, 60-year-olds having love affairs? I hope I have that much energy when I'm his age. He went on, saying this guy worked the same shift as Harold and had the perfect opportunity, though nothing was ever proven. In the following weeks, I heard various versions of Harold's demise. In some tellings, it wasn't a grinding mill that got him, but an industrial saw, if that was supposed to sound any better. In other versions, Harold got his sleeve caught in a conveyor belt that dragged him into the machinery. The details shifted, but some elements remained constant. Harold was an older man, his death was always gruesome, and many believed it wasn't an accident. Another coworker, I'll call him Charlie, asked me one day if I'd ever heard noises at night from the oldest part of the plant. I said no, as I'd only worked one night shift so far. Charlie nodded gravely and warned me I would eventually. He explained that maintenance staff never went into that section alone after dark because they claimed to hear footsteps and machinery starting on its own. He added that one guy swore he'd seen Harold himself standing at his old workstation just staring. I laughed it off. Every workplace has its ghost stories. But I admit, after these tales, I found myself glancing at the old section of the plant more often. About 4 months after I started, I was working a double shift, and due to staffing shortages, my eyes were already tired and blurring. On my way to the restroom, I took a shortcut through a rarely used corridor that led into the older part of the plant. The floor was wet from condensation, always a hazard in food processing, and I was very mindful of my step. About halfway down, I felt distinct pressure on my ankle, as if someone had stuck their foot out to trip me. I stumbled forward, arms flailing as I tried to regain my balance. To my right was an inactive grinding mill. Even inactive, I could imagine a fall into it could be painful or even fatal. For a brief moment, I was convinced I was going down. I could already feel the cold metal against me. My heart pounded as I braced myself against the wall, my fingernails scraping against the concrete. When I turned, I expected to see someone, maybe a laughing coworker, but the corridor was completely empty. I stood there, breathing hard, staring at the empty space where I'd felt the pressure. Just then, the light directly above that spot flickered and died, plunging me into darkness. I called out, asking if anyone was there, my voice sounding frightened and panicked, but I got no reply, just the distant hum of machinery from the active part of the plant. I told myself I was too tired, that I was imagining things. But as I hurried back to the main area, leaving the grinding mill behind me, a cold, ancient doubt spread through me. Something had tried to trip me. Something I couldn't see. I didn't tell Cheryl about this incident at the plant. She had enough stress with her job search and settling the girls, and honestly, I thought I'd just imagined it. Exhaustion sometimes plays tricks on you. But about a week later, something happened at our home. On a day off, I was alone in the kitchen, washing dishes while Cheryl took the girls to their new doctor's appointments. The radio played softly, a country station, one of the few we could get clearly. I was elbow deep in soapy water when I suddenly felt something. A firm push directly between my shoulder blades. It wasn't violent, but distinct enough that I stumbled forward, hitting the edge of the sink, splashing water onto my shirt. I spun around, heart racing, but the kitchen was empty. I called out, asking if anyone was there, but the house remained silent save for the quiet radio and the steady drip of a faucet. Afterwards, I checked every room, convinced an intruder had slipped into our house, but all the doors were locked and the windows were secure. Returning to the kitchen, I felt uneasy. Just then, the radio signal shifted to harsh white noise, making me jump. When I tried to change the station, it snapped back to the country station as if nothing had happened. These incidents started small. First, individual items would move from their places. Then, cold spots would appear in random areas of the house, and I'd constantly feel like I was being watched, whether showering or changing. I tried to rationalize it all. Was it just an old, creaky house? Or maybe unusually magnetic ground, if such a thing existed? But I just couldn't fully explain it. The pushes continued, always from behind, always when I least expected it. Once, when I was in the garage getting tools. Another time as I walked up the stairs. And again when I stood at the stove in the kitchen, feeling that shove. It was never hard enough to hurt me, not yet anyway, but it was persistent, as if someone was trying to get my attention. After about a month of these occurrences, I casually mentioned at lunch that I'd been feeling strange at the plant, that I felt like I'd been pushed during that first incident. Charlie shook his head, laughed a little as if he'd heard it many times before, then surprisingly lowered his voice and asked if anything had happened at my house. My mouth hung open and I asked him how he could possibly know that. Charlie leaned back, arms crossed, and said it must be Harold. You mean the guy who died in the accident? I asked. With a terse, he confirmed, explaining that it doesn't happen to everyone, but those Harold takes an interest in get affected. He paused, staring at me for a moment, then added that I resembled Harold a bit. Something about my eyes and my jawline. That sent shivers down my spine. I said that was ridiculous, but he countered that maybe there was something to it, pointing out there was a picture of Harold in the hallway by HR, part of a memorial wall for employees who died. He suggested I go look at it if I didn't believe him. So, that same afternoon I went to the memorial wall. It was a modest collection of framed photos, small plaques with names and years of service. Most of the photos were formal portraits or candid shots from company picnics. Harold's was towards the end of the line, a color photo from the mid-70s. He had thinning gray hair, deep-set eyes, and a prominent jaw. The brass plaque simply read, Harold Vance, 1916 to 1976, 30 years of service. It was obvious. There was a resemblance. Not so much that we were twins, but enough that it stood out. Same eye color, same jawline, even the left eyebrow on both of us was slightly higher than the right. I stared at the photo, and for a moment, I could have sworn Harold's eyes were looking back at me. It startled me so much I almost bumped into a passing secretary. Excuse me," I mumbled, hurrying away. After that, the incidents escalated. Maybe Harold knew I'd seen his picture. The pushes became more frequent and intense, and suddenly, doors started slamming shut even with no draft, and the TV turned itself on multiple times, blasting static in the middle of the night. Our girls complained of nightmares, an old man standing at the foot of their beds, watching them. Cheryl soon noticed something was wrong with the house. One evening, when a shelf full of dishes collapsed for no apparent reason, she asked, "Is this house haunted?" Of course, I lied, saying it was just an old, somewhat unstable and creaky house. But I was wrong. The worst was yet to come. On a Tuesday evening in November, I'd just gotten home from work. I was in the shower, trying to wash off the plant smell, while Cheryl was downstairs in the kitchen preparing dinner, and the girls were in their room, supposedly doing homework. I was just turning off the water when I suddenly heard ear-splitting screams. Not normal kid screams, but screams of utter terror that froze my blood. I hastily wrapped a towel around myself and practically ran out of the shower, almost slipping on the wet floor. The screams were coming from the girls' room. Cheryl was already at the door, pulling on the handle, shouting back, asking what was wrong. When she saw me, she yelled that she couldn't open the door because it was locked, and the girls were trapped inside, screaming. I yelled for the kids to open the door, rattling the handle myself. Melissa's voice came through, high-pitched and panicked, saying they couldn't open it, that it was stuck. She shrieked that there was a man at the window, and Jenny was screaming too, her voice like a wild horse neighing. We hadn't put locks on the upstairs doors, so there was no way the door could be locked. I told Cheryl to stand clear before I slammed my shoulder into the door. The pain shot through my collarbone, but the door didn't budge. On the fourth try, something splintered and the door flew open. The two girls were huddled in the corner, far from the window, clinging to each other, weeping. The window was wide open, cold November air pouring in, and the curtains billowed wildly in the wind. I rushed to the kids while Cheryl closed the window, asking what happened and who opened it. Between sobs, Jenny explained it was that old man who'd been standing outside looking in. Cheryl said that was impossible since we were on the second floor, but Melissa insisted, her face pale with terror, saying the man had indeed been there. She explained he told them to just climb out and he'd catch them. I leaned out the window to look. There was no ledge, no tree branch to step on, just a sheer drop to the frost-covered backyard. "I don't see anyone out there," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, though a deep unease was growing inside me. "Girls, you had a nightmare or something," I tried to explain. As night fell, we all spent it in the living room, the girls huddled together on the pull-out couch. Nobody said much, but I felt Cheryl's unspoken questions growing in her mind. She wanted to know what was going on. I should have told her everything. About the incidents at the plant, the pushes at home, Harold's photo, and our uncanny resemblance. But I feared she'd think I was losing my mind, so I merely agreed that something was wrong with the house and suggested we start looking for a new place. After Cheryl fell asleep, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, feeling guilty for not telling her everything, and it felt like someone else was in the room, something that was terrorizing my family. The following week, we moved out of the house into hotels while desperately searching for a new home. I called in sick to work, using some of my precious sick days. The eerie occurrences seemed to subside as long as we weren't in the house, which solidified Cheryl's conviction that the problem was the building. The following Monday, I returned to work, exhausted and tense. When I saw Charlie again, he asked me if it was getting better or worse. Too tired to lie, I told him the truth. The ghost had tried to get my kids to jump out of a second-story window. Charlie was completely shocked, and I explained that I needed to get out of that place, move as far away as possible. Again and again, Charlie agreed, but then added regretfully that Harold's ghost had always been angry, but he'd never seen anything like this, and he didn't like it one bit. Fortunately for me, that day was my last at Westland. I told the plant manager I had a family emergency and wouldn't be returning, and I wasn't lying. On my way to my car, I passed the old section of the plant. I felt I had to say something, and I called out loudly into the seemingly empty space, "Harold, I'm sorry for what happened to you, but please, leave my family alone." Then I hurried to my car and never looked back. We moved hours away, finally finding a job at a railroad company in Oregon. The pay was less, but the hours were regular, and there were no lingering entities trying to harm my children. Life returned to normal, and it has stayed normal ever since. I started working for a particular railroad company in 1986, inspecting tracks across the Northwest. Most people don't understand how much maintenance railroad tracks require. These massive steel beams, carrying tons of cargo daily, expand, contract, warp, and wear down in ways that demand constant monitoring. That's where I came in, a track inspector walking miles of remote railway lines, spotting problems before they led to derailments. I'm nearing retirement now. My sister-in-law thinks I should write down some of my experiences while my memory's still fresh. Mostly, I think she's referring to the stories I tell her kids about encounters with wildlife and some of the strange characters you meet in remote rail yards. But there's one experience from the summer of 1988 I've never told them. Never told anyone except my supervisor at the time, who transferred departments not long after. I was 32 then, 2 years into the job, still trying to prove myself. I was single, dating here and there, but nothing serious. However, my brother, Christopher, had died 8 months prior at 38 from a sudden aneurysm, leaving behind his wife and 3 kids under 10. On my days off, I often helped her out, taking my nephews to Little League games and my niece to her dance classes, trying to fill Christopher's shoes as best I could, though no one could truly replace him. In June, I was assigned to inspect a 40-mile stretch of track running through a remote area in eastern Montana. The track had been showing unusual wear patterns that didn't align with normal use. My job was to manually check sections of the track with specialized equipment, take readings, and document any irregularities. I checked into a small motel in the nearest town, about 20 minutes from my work site. It was a no-frills place, wood-paneled, worn bedspreads, but it had hot water and was clean enough for me. The lady at the front desk became more animated when I mentioned I'd be working on the rail line. She asked which section I'd be inspecting, and when I told her, her expression shifted slightly. She mentioned her grandfather had helped build that stretch of track in the early 1900s. He'd always claimed it was cursed ground, and that the original survey team had all died under strange circumstances. I politely nodded, giving little credence to these tales. Every small town has its stories. Railroad folklore is rife with ghosts and curses, which isn't surprising for a profession that's claimed many lives over the decades. My first day on site was uneventful. The rails looked normal at first glance, but my measurements indicated unusual deformities not explainable by normal wear. The patterns were highly symmetrical, occurring at exact same intervals for almost a quarter mile in what we called Section 42. The precision bothered me. Nature doesn't work with such regularity, nor do train wheels behave that way. Plus, I noticed my equipment was behaving strangely in that section. The electronic gauges fluctuated wildly, and my fully charged batteries drained in less than an hour. I had to switch to manual tools, the old-fashioned calipers and bubble levels railroaders had used for a century. It was twilight when I first saw him. I was about halfway through the section, busy with measurements, kneeling beside the rail with my back to the setting sun. When I stood up to check my notes, I noticed a man standing about 100 yards ahead of me beside the tracks. By itself, this wasn't unusual. It wasn't uncommon for locals to walk along the rails, though this was a particularly remote stretch. What struck me, however, was his attire. He wore a suit cut in a style that seemed decades old, not quite antique but definitely not modern, not 1980s fashion. In the fading light, I could barely make out his features. I called out a customary greeting, but the distance prevented me from discerning his reaction. Still, something about his posture seemed to subtly shift. He straightened up, his body language becoming unnaturally rigid. I took a few steps towards him, then I saw his smile become visible even from that distance, just very wide and radiant. I lowered my gaze for a brief moment to close my notebook, and when I looked up again, I swear he was gone. Just like that. The landscape offered little cover. It was just flat terrain with sparse vegetation. No one could have moved out of sight that quickly. I finished my work for the day and drove back to the motel, trying to rationalize what I'd seen. Maybe it was a hiker who ducked behind the rail. Maybe an optical trick that made a natural object appear human. But the rational explanations didn't quite fit. They were better than the alternatives, at least. That night, I dreamt of the same man standing at the foot of my bed, just staring at me, smiling. I woke up at 3 a.m., drenched in sweat, unable to fall back asleep. The next morning, I called my supervisor to report the unusual readings from Section 42, but I didn't mention the man I'd seen. My supervisor said the readings were concerning enough that he'd send another inspector to join me for safety. The integrity of rails in remote areas was not taken lightly by the company. A derailment in the middle of nowhere could cost millions and potentially dozens of lives. My partner arrived late that afternoon. Oddly, everyone called him Goop. He was a seasoned, heavily built inspector in his late 40s who'd been working there much longer than I had. On the drive to the site, I asked about his nickname. He explained it was because he always carried a snack he called goobers, which he made himself and offered me some from a paper bag. They were sweet, nutty clusters that tasted pretty good. But when I asked for the recipe, he just winked and said it was a family secret. Goop was exactly what you'd expect from a longtime railroader. Knowledgeable, uncompromising on safety, but full of colorful stories from his years on the job. He made for good company as we continued taking measurements in Section 42. After what I'd seen, I was glad to have company. The equipment problems continued. Goop's gauges malfunctioned in the exact same way mine did, and his watch completely stopped when we entered the section, only restarting when we left it. Strange, huh? He frowned about it, but didn't say much else besides he'd never seen anything like the wear patterns we were measuring. Around 1 p.m., we took a lunch break, sitting on some maintenance blocks near the tracks. I was mid-bite into a sandwich when I spotted him again, the smiling man. This time he was about 200 yards further down the track, watching us. In daylight, I could see him much more clearly. He wore a dark suit with a vest, his hair neatly parted, and that unsettling smile fixed on his face. His skin was pale, almost waxy even from that distance. I nudged Goop and pointed in his direction, asking if he saw that man. Goop squinted and shook his head. He couldn't make anyone out. So I described the man's appearance to him. Then Goop's expression changed. He asked if I was sure about the clothes. When I confirmed, he quickly packed up his lunch and suggested we move to another section and come back to this one later. As we walked away, I looked back once more and the man was gone again. That evening, back at the motel, Goop and I went over our findings with a few beers in my room. After the technical details were discussed, I pressed him to tell me more about his reaction to my earlier sighting. Hesitantly, he finally began to share that his grandfather had worked that same railroad line in the 1930s. His grandfather had suddenly quit railroading after an inspection trip in that exact section, refusing to talk about what happened ever since, other than to say he'd seen things that couldn't be explained. The family assumed he'd seen a bad accident or found a body on the tracks. But my description of the man in old-fashioned clothes with an unusual smile had triggered something in Goop's memory, a hushed story he'd overheard as a kid when his grandfather had too much to drink at a family gathering. After Goop went back to his room, I took a shower. The bathroom was tiny, just a stall shower and a plastic curtain. I was rinsing shampoo from my hair, eyes closed, when I felt something shift in the air, maybe a drop in temperature, I don't know. But when I opened my eyes, I saw through the shower curtain a distinct silhouette. Tall, motionless, standing directly on the other side. In a panic, I ripped the curtain aside, sending soap dishes clattering, but the bathroom was empty. The door was still locked from the inside, just as I'd left it. I barely slept that night. The next morning, Goop looked pretty rough. He admitted he felt sick and had a pounding headache. He also mentioned it felt like someone had been watching him all night, even though he was alone in his room, blinds drawn and door locked. After a couple of hours trying to get some work done, he decided to head back to base, promising to send another partner if available. Before he left, he pulled me aside, far from the tracks. His usual calm tone was gone. He explained to me that his grandfather had been working that section alone after his partner unexpectedly quit, and what happened after was so terrible that the family never spoke of it again. Goop warned me to be careful, and to consider asking for a transfer to a different section. Then he added something else, something strange. He asked if I had a brother. When I mentioned Christopher, who'd recently passed away, Goop nodded as if something in his memory confirmed itself. Then he simply got into his truck and drove away. I continued my work alone, methodically documenting the irregularities in Section 42. As the day progressed, the feeling of being watched grew until it felt almost physical, like a pressure on the back of my neck. Late one afternoon, I knelt to check a particularly unusual wear pattern when I heard footsteps in the gravel beside the tracks. When I looked up, I was facing the smiling man, now less than 10 feet away. Up close, he was even more unsettling. His suit was immaculate, yet clearly from another era, with a pocket watch chain visible across his vest. His skin had a bloodless quality no living person should possess. But it was his face that froze me. Features that initially seemed normal became increasingly uncanny the longer I stared at him. His smile revealed too many teeth, perfectly straight and white, and his eyes, I swear they seemed normal at first, but as he stared at me, they darkened until they were black, like dark ink dropped into water. Then he spoke, saying a name. But it wasn't mine. Christopher, he said. I corrected him immediately, explaining Christopher was my brother, and he was dead. The words left my mouth before I even considered if I should continue to engage with this being, whatever or whoever it was. His smile widened as if that were even possible, and then he simply said, "Wrong brother." It sounded like multiple people were speaking in unison, yet slightly out of sync. The shrill tone of a train horn broke the moment. Instinctively, I turned towards the sound, and when I looked back, you guessed it, the man was gone. A few minutes later, an eastbound freight train rumbled by, the engineer giving me a casual wave as track inspectors were an everyday sight. After the train passed, I looked at my notebook, open on the ground where I'd been working. Flipping through it, I discovered page after page covered with the same handwritten phrase, "Not for me, wrong brother, wrong brother, wrong brother." I finished my inspection as quickly as I could and drove back to the motel, too rattled to even think about stopping for food. In my motel room, from the bedside phone, I called my supervisor and reported everything. The readings, the equipment failures, and yes, the man with the impossible smile who happened to know my brother's name. To his credit, my supervisor didn't just dismiss my claims. He asked a few questions about the track conditions and promised to send a full team to properly inspect the section. I was so exhausted that I slept almost soundly that night, except for waking up at 3 a.m. again because something didn't feel right. The bedside lamp was on, though I was sure I'd turned it off. On the nightstand, several small objects were arranged in a circle. My brother's pocket watch, engraved with his initials, a silver dollar he carried for luck, and his wedding ring. Items I didn't just have on me. None of them should have been in my motel room. The watch and silver dollar were part of a small box of personal effects I kept at my apartment, and the ring, that had been buried with him. At first light, I checked out and never returned to that section. I finished my reports, and that was that for then. 6 months later, I heard through company channels that a freight train had derailed there despite the repairs made after I left. I wasn't given the exact reason. Last month, my nephew, I'll call him James, Christopher's oldest son, who's now in his 40s with kids of his own, was helping me clear out some old boxes for my garage. He found a folder of sketches I'd made in my early days at the railroad. Mostly technical drawings of track components, but mixed in was a rough sketch of a smiling man. James asked who it was when he saw it. It was instantly chillingly familiar. I told him it was just some random guy I'd seen on the job. But then he said something that alarmed me. He told me his 10-year-old had been drawing a similar-looking figure for quite some time now. A man with a very wide smile, black eyes, and wearing a suit from a bygone era. I don't know what any of this means. I don't know what that man is or why he's fixated on my brother, but he better damn well leave my family alone. It all started around May 2012. My sister and her fiancé were temporarily living at my parents' house because she'd recently been in a bad accident and couldn't afford her medical bills or rent. We didn't have much money either, but we lived, and still do, in a large 4-bedroom house, so it was no problem accommodating them. At the time, I was a lonely 13-year-old girl who'd been homeschooled my entire life. Even though summer had just begun, I had no plans or friends to hang out with. I spent most of my time in my room, pulling the curtains shut, listening to music, and reading paranormal stories online. I admit I was depressed and desperate for someone to spend my time with. To be honest, during that time, I even dabbled in satanic spells and such. I performed many different rituals, read spells aloud, and prayed to various entities that were anything but good. But after a while, I stopped because it all seemed ridiculous. I realized it was all absurd. About a week after I finally stopped all these satanic activities, I was lying in bed, reading. I remember this night very clearly because it was by far the scariest thing I've ever experienced. While my parents and the rest of my family were downstairs in the living room watching Sherlock Holmes, it wasn't a movie trying to play tricks on me as much as I wish it were. I was quietly playing some Pink songs in the background. Suddenly, I noticed a faint scratching sound. At first, I thought something was wrong with the recording and paused the song. But the scratching continued. Scratch, scratch, scratch. Then I realized where the sound was coming from, the large, mirrored closet with doors that took up the entire wall opposite my bed. I called out for whiskey, thinking my cat must have crawled into the closet and gotten stuck. My cat is very vocal, but there was no reply to my call. I got up, slowly approached the door and cautiously opened it. Immediately, the scratching stopped. I searched behind the hanging clothes and everywhere my cat could have been, but found nothing. It wasn't until I pushed the clothes aside that I heard the same scratching noises coming from the hangers themselves, hanging on a metal rod. That realization made me slam the door shut and jump back into bed. I told myself I must have imagined it, so I turned the music back up and continued reading. But a short time later, that scratching sound started again. Scratch, scratch, scratch. I swear I felt every hair follicle on my body stand up. What the hell was in my closet? I cranked up my music to drown out the sound, but the louder the music got, the clearer the scratching became. To fight against the noise, I flipped the page in my book, paused the music, and listened. Sure enough, the scratching stopped for a moment. I thought with relief, oh, thank God it's over. But I was wrong. Within seconds, I heard a slight clinking as if metal was hitting metal, followed by dragging noises, like long garments being pulled across carpet. The sound moved from the closed closet, went past the foot of my bed, and finally reached my younger sister's bed, where it either lingered or something sat down because the sound abruptly stopped. I sat there, petrified, staring at the empty spot on the bed opposite me and clearly heard breathing. You know that feeling when you can feel someone staring at you? Well, this was that, only worse because I couldn't see who or what it was. I tried to call out to someone, anyone, hoping my mom would come upstairs and enter my room, but only a hoarse croak came from my lips, accompanied by frightened tears streaming down my face. I couldn't move. I stared first at the hallway door, then back at the empty bed. Finally, I felt the tension in the air ease and I bolted for the door, grabbed the handle, and managed to get out. I ran downstairs as if my life depended on it. Who knows, maybe it did. I sat behind the sofa while everyone continued watching TV. They didn't notice me sitting there, shaking and teary-eyed, but at least I wasn't alone anymore. A few hours passed, during which I just sat there, until my mom told me it was late and I clearly needed sleep. But I didn't want to go back upstairs alone, so I asked my sister to come with me. She sat on her bed and I told her what had happened. I couldn't tell if she believed me, but I was clearly shaken, so she offered to leave her night light on. Surprisingly, I slept well after that, no more scratching, no anything. A few days passed and I spent less and less time alone in my room, not wanting whatever had been there to return. But then, one morning, just as the sun was rising, I opened my eyes. I looked around the room, noticed the first rays of sun peeking through the sea blue blinds, and suddenly felt an enormous pressure on my chest. When I looked down, I spotted a strange face, no more than 6 inches from mine, paler than my bedsheets, with human features, thin lips and a narrow nose. But the lips were icy blue, and the pupils barely visible, just tiny gray slits along the outer edge of its face. I could see something that looked like stitches and the start of black hair, but no body, as if it had poked its face through a portal to watch me sleep, while I still felt its body weight. All I remember is staring at it, then feeling incredibly sleepy and falling back asleep. I've talked to several people about this and they said it sounded like sleep paralysis, but I could move my head, so I don't think it was that. After this incident, strange things kept happening. Lights turned on, the music box in the fireplace wound itself up one day while I was in the living room, and I even started to think it might be a friendly ghost because it wasn't hurting me, just following me. But I was definitely wrong. Things took a darker turn. One night, I woke up from a vivid nightmare in which a pale, bald entity with deep black eye sockets rose from a lake of black water and slowly approached me. I jumped up and asked my sister if she could move her bed next to mine, just to give me some comfort, but she complained that her bed kept getting pulled away from mine during the night. The situations kept getting worse. My sister complained that invisible hands would wrap around her neck when she tried to sleep, or that she was being watched by unseen eyes. I thought it must be because of me, so I moved into the guest room. The first night I stayed in the separate room, I heard my sister calling my name from the other room. I went to see what was wrong and found her crying. She reported that she had just turned off her light to go to sleep when she heard someone knocking on the window from outside. I went to the curtains and saw nothing but pitch black darkness outside, keeping in mind the room was on the second floor, so the window was about 15 feet off the ground. Stumped, I offered for her to come to my room. After that, I began having vivid nightmares every night. In all these dreams, I saw a tall, dark figure in a long black trench coat with long dark hair, telling me detailed stories about things it had seen. I even started to look forward to these encounters. I called it Ali, short for Alistair. It was a name I'd never heard before, which just made it stranger. I talked to my parents about what was happening, which I later regretted because it seemed to anger Alistair. The dreams changed. I was touched violently, and sometimes even during the day I felt something moving back and forth under my clothes. Finally, I moved again, and for a few weeks, everything was normal again until that night when I woke up with pressure in my lower abdomen and looked up to see the silhouette of a bony, bald, humanoid entity above me. The next morning, I immediately ran to my mom. I couldn't hold it back any longer and broke down in front of her, which was very unlike me. Fortunately, she took it seriously. She brought in some friends who called themselves spiritual healers, and they prayed over me daily for days. Thankfully, it seemed to work and things got better. I'm so glad I wasn't trapped in that terrible loop, being haunted by spirits every night. All I can say is don't laugh at everything you read. Sometimes there's more to it than meets the eye. Do you have your office ghost stories? Well, here's mine and what became of it. I was working at this marketing firm, an office building. HR put me through all the usual onboarding stuff. Benefits, the performance package, the organizational chart, a building tour. But there was one quirk I still remember clearly. When the HR rep showed me where the restrooms were, she pointed down the hall and explained the ladies' room was the third door on the right. Then she added, almost casually but with a peculiar seriousness beneath her smile, that most women preferred to use the second-floor restroom. She didn't elaborate, just said it was more reliable, and gave me a knowing look before showing me the break room. About a week later, I asked my desk neighbor in my cubicle about this strange recommendation. We were walking to get coffee together when I asked her why everyone avoided the restroom on our floor, even though it was clearly the most convenient. She told me that for almost 7 years, there had been talk that the third-floor ladies' room was haunted. The company had called in the janitorial service multiple times to look for plumbing problems or electrical malfunctions that could explain the occurrences, but they never found anything wrong with the facilities. Eventually, management stopped investigating, and most employees silently adopted the unwritten rule to use the second-floor restroom instead. Of course, I had to know more. My curiosity was piqued. Hesitantly, she shared her own experiences. When she first started, she had used the third-floor restroom before anyone warned her about it. While inside a stall, she heard soft crying coming from the adjacent stall. Assuming someone was having a bad day, she called out, asking if everything was okay. The crying stopped instantly. When she exited her own stall, she checked the neighboring one and found it had been empty the entire time. That day, during my lunch break, I decided to gather more stories if there were any. A woman from accounting admitted she dismissed all the tales about the haunted restroom as mere office folklore until she experienced something herself about 2 years ago. She used to consider herself a skeptic and even intentionally used that restroom to prove everyone wrong. While washing her hands, she clearly saw a woman with long dark hair standing behind her in the mirror. Kate spun around, but no one was there. When she looked back in the mirror, the figure was gone. Ever since, she's exclusively used the second-floor restroom. Other stories followed a similar pattern. It seemed no one ever truly felt alone in that restroom. Truth be told, I'd always been fascinated by ghost stories. As a kid, I dragged my parents to supposedly haunted places during vacations, and in college, I joined the Paranormal Investigation Club, mostly as an excuse to explore abandoned buildings at night. Instead of being deterred by these stories, I was curious. One night, I had to stay late working on a pitch deck for a client meeting. Around 9 p.m., the office was empty. Everyone else had gone home hours ago. As I saved my files and prepared to leave, I thought, probably foolishly, that this was the perfect opportunity to investigate the third-floor restroom without anyone noticing. The hallway was dimly lit, only the security lights were on. I pushed open the heavy door to the ladies' room and flipped the light switch. Everything looked perfectly ordinary and clean. White tiles for stalls, 3 sinks with a large mirror, a paper towel dispenser on the wall. Nothing ominous. I felt a little silly as I used the first stall as usual. No ghostly wailing, nothing of the sort. I washed my hands, repeatedly checking the mirror, but saw nothing unusual. I smiled inwardly, thinking, so much for the office ghost. Then I dried my hands and headed for the exit. The door had one of those push plates instead of a handle, the kind where you just lean against it to open it. I pushed against it, but it didn't budge. I figured I hadn't pushed hard enough, so I put my shoulder into it and still nothing. The door felt like it was locked from the outside, which made no sense for a restroom door. And then the lights went out. Not a flicker, not a gradual dimming, but an instantaneous blackout. There were no windows in that restroom, no other light source. It was complete, absolute darkness. My heart immediately started to race. I fumbled in my purse for my phone to use as a flashlight, but it wouldn't turn on. I'd been at the office all day and it was already dead. I knew the battery was dead, so I wondered why I even tried. I backed away from the door, feeling my way along the wall until I reached a corner. There, I sat down on the floor, trying to steady my breathing. It's just an electrical problem, I told myself. The door's sticking because of some pressure or something, because the ventilation is off too. But then I heard something. The soft, unmistakable sound of wet, bare feet on tile. The footsteps were slow, a gentle slap, a short pause, another slap, pause. They moved across the restroom floor, heading directly toward me. I pulled my knees to my chest, making myself as small as possible. The footsteps came closer until they stopped directly in front of me, so close I should have felt someone standing there. I held my breath, unable to move or unwilling to, as something cold brushed along my cheek. Not quite a hand, more like fingers made of mist, I squeezed my eyes shut, though it was useless in that darkness. Suddenly, the light snapped back on with a harsh hum. The sudden brightness was blinding, and as my eyes adjusted, I saw I was alone in the restroom. But the exit door was now slightly ajar, gently swinging as if someone had just passed through it. I scrambled to my feet in record time, almost tripping through the door, and ran until I reached the elevator. My hands shaking, I packed up my belongings from my desk and left the building. The next day, I considered telling someone about the incident. Part of me wondered if I had just scared myself so much that I'd imagined it all. But when I got to my desk, I found a small puddle of water under my chair, as if someone with wet feet had been sitting there, waiting for me. Yes, I use the second-floor restroom now. Some company traditions exist for good reason. My job takes me to a particular place I have to go to because it's my job, but I hate it. That would be apartment 412. I clean apartments for a property management company. When tenants move out, I go in with my supplies, clean everything top to bottom, take pictures for the leasing agent, and then move on to the next. Most apartments have their quirks. Some have water damage, others carpet stains, or stubborn grime that won't come off no matter what you use. And then there are the ones where occupants forget things and you get to take a little souvenir home. Just kidding. I have to call management in those cases and tell them something was left behind so the former tenants have an opportunity to retrieve it. But there's one unit whose call on my work schedule I always dread, and yet it's my most frequent apartment. Apartment 412. This unit has seen more tenant turnovers than any other property I've ever managed. People usually stay maybe 3-4 months at most, then suddenly break their lease. The property manager has told me she thinks it's the street noise, or maybe faulty plumbing, but I know better. In the last 2 years, I've been in that apartment at least 8 times, and something happens with every visit. The first time it was subtle. I followed my usual routine. Kitchen first, then bathrooms, bedrooms, and living room. About 20 minutes in, I heard something that sounded like breathing. Not loud, just a gentle inhale and exhale like you'd hear from someone sleeping. I checked every room, hoping maybe the tenant was still there, or even a squatter, but the entire apartment was empty. Still, I swore the breathing followed me from room to room, sometimes from behind me, sometimes beside me, and the feeling of being watched was so intense that I kept looking around, expecting to spot someone. I told myself it was the old vents or pipes, my imagination playing tricks after a long day's work, but I was working overtime to finish the apartment and wasn't taking a break. The second time, about 4 months later, a new tenant had moved out after only 10 weeks. The apartment was a mess. It looked like they'd left in a hurry. I set my cleaning cart down in the kitchen and went to get supplies from the bathroom. It couldn't have taken more than 30 seconds because when I came back, my cart was gone. I checked every room thinking I'd absent-mindedly wheeled it somewhere, but it wasn't there. My frustration grew until I happened to look out the balcony window. There was my cleaning cart, perfectly balanced on a tree branch extending close to the building. The balcony door was locked from the inside, the windows were closed, and I was on the 4th floor. I called my supervisor and explained I couldn't finish the job because I'd forgotten essential supplies. Ultimately, the shortfall was deducted from my pay rather than me having to go back. There were other incidents that day. Faucets turning on by themselves, doors slamming shut even with no draft, and once my alarm went off with a voice message I'd never recorded, though I couldn't make out what it said. But the worst happened about a month later. The new tenant had moved out after only 6 weeks, a record. The apartment wasn't even particularly dirty, there was just a little dust. The bathroom needed some attention but nothing major. I was almost done. I had just packed up my supplies and was heading straight for the door. I even had my hand on the doorknob when I suddenly felt something cold wrap around my ankle. Before I could react, I was pulled backward with incredible force. My chin slammed against the hardwood floor and I bit my tongue. My cleaning cart flew across the room. Whatever had grabbed me dragged me across the floor, from the entryway through the living room. I clawed at the floor, almost ripping off my fingernails, in a desperate attempt to grab onto anything to stop myself. The thing dragged me into the master bedroom, then the bathroom, and finally back towards the second bedroom. All the while, I was screaming like a maniac, begging whatever it was to stop and let me go. Its grip was like icy iron pressure, closing around both ankles, feeling like hands only larger. When it finally let go, I heard a new sound in the second bedroom, a deep, booming laugh that seemed to come directly from the walls. It didn't sound amused or friendly, but satisfied, as if it had achieved what it wanted. I scrambled to my feet in a record time and ran, leaving my supplies behind. From the parking lot, I called my supervisor, my voice trembling, and explained I would not be returning to apartment 412. I even threatened to quit, but they calmed me down and said I didn't have to go back to that unit. Thank goodness. I met the coworker who was taking over 412 for me. I thought about warning him, but instead I just wished him luck and walked away. Some things you just have to experience for yourself to believe, and I've had enough of that place. I still have terrible nightmares about being dragged across the floor, and sometimes I wake up, almost feeling that cold pressure on my ankles. I've heard ghost stories my whole life. They're interesting, yes, but I never thought a ghost could nearly kill you. Maybe I'm just exaggerating. It all began 2 or 3 years ago when my family and I moved into a new, small neighborhood in Tucson, Arizona. We rented a new house that was connected to another house. Luckily, we were separated by a wall. At the time, we had at least 4 dogs before we eventually got up to 7 because we loved dogs, sometimes more than ourselves. In our small 2-bedroom, 1-bathroom house, we didn't have much furniture back then. A few months before the move, my mother had been accused of seeing another man, so my stepfather didn't want to see her or my sister and me, but somehow things always seemed to sort themselves out. A somewhat long story. For the first few months we lived in that house, I was in a phase where I constantly watched Ghost Adventures and always wore black. In hindsight, I'm not proud of it, but as I said, it was just a phase. Every time I watched that show, I'd get an eerie feeling as if someone was watching me from a corner of the living room, and every time I looked over, not surprisingly, I'd see nothing, just my dog staring at me. That was strange. As the year progressed, while we were still living in our house, my mother's birthday had just passed a few days prior, so she and my stepfather went to an adult art class where they painted and drank. Together, they painted a cherry blossom tree, which I thought was pretty. They hung the resulting painting in our house, and for some reason, when I looked at it, I felt something bad was going to happen, though I had no rational reason for it. I pushed that feeling aside and tried to forget about it. Only a few days after my mom's birthday, my grandmother would occasionally stop by during my school hours. One day, when I came home from school, my grandmother told me that she and my mother had both seen a dark, small shadow, about the size of my autistic cousin, and that it had disappeared into the area where the furnace was. This was bizarre, and at first I didn't believe them. But this wasn't the first time I'd experienced something supernatural. Apparently, my mother and stepfather had found a broken, shattered Jesus statue in our backyard shortly before this incident, somewhere it didn't belong. When they saw it, my stepfather spotted the dark figure of a man running away from the scene. He gave chase, but as soon as he rounded the corner of the house, the man was gone, as if he'd never existed. My mother then started doing research and found out that about 5 years prior, a man in his late 20s or early 30s had been shot and died in our backyard. You'd think the people who rented us this house would at least inform us about that before we signed a lease. After hearing about the statue incident, my grandmother and I decided to investigate. We gathered the broken pieces of the statue and brought them home to clean and dry them. With glue and tape, we reassembled it as best we could. When we were done, we put it back in its usual spot, making sure it stood steadily before we leaned back. But a few days later, the statue was destroyed again, and to do that, someone had to go into the backyard, get the statue, and throw it back on the ground. There was no way it had just fallen. Soon, my mother began acting strangely. Her actions, her mood, even her personality changed. She told us she was seeing this black shadow more and more frequently, once in the corner of her room, once in the shower. One day, my mother took my sister and me to church, and during the service, she began desperately looking for the pastor. Suddenly, her eyes welled up with tears, and my sister and I immediately worried about her. Since the pastor wasn't present, we took a bottle of holy water with us. My sister drove while my mother lay in the back seat, feeling sick and exhausted. For some reason, my head spun. I knew this spirit was somehow toying with my mother, but I didn't know how to help her, which worried me even more. Back home, we were assailed by a disgusting smell. It smelled of burnt cigarettes, which made me nauseous. While I lay at home, trying to forget the stressful evening, my sister came into the room and urged me to quickly go to the living room and get the holy water. I followed her and saw my mother lying on the floor, stacked on 3 sofa cushions. Her lips were moving, and she was speaking in a language I didn't know if you could even call it a language. As I went over to her and spoke to her, her eyes opened so violently it took my breath away. Her eyes radiated an icy, menacing glare, and she stared into my soul. In a voice completely unlike her own, she snarled something, "Nothing will stop until we leave this place." This shadow was undoubtedly something evil and had tried to harm my mother or take her away from us. If you ever plan to buy or rent a house, you should research thoroughly because the person selling or renting it to you might lie or forget to tell you something important about its history. I've never forgotten that night and what I experienced, and precisely because of that, I'm very careful with anything related to spirits. The two-story house I lived in had been converted into 2 apartments. At the time, I lived with my boyfriend in the second-floor apartment. It was an old house with wooden floors, antique furnishings, and an attic. The attic had one of those pull-down stairs that dropped from a hatch in the ceiling. It consisted of little more than crossbeams and old pink insulation packed between the joists. We mostly used it to show off this creepy space to our friends. Again and again, I'd wake up at night to use the restroom. I'd always been afraid of the dark. Even today, that old eerie feeling sometimes overcomes me. I had to pass through the hallway leading to the kitchen to get to the bathroom, and every time I did, I felt like something was there. I told myself my imagination was playing tricks on me. One night, already in the bathroom, I suddenly heard strange creaking noises, seemingly coming from the hallway next to the bathroom. I immediately held my breath and listened intently. It was undeniably the creaking of floorboards. My boyfriend was asleep in the bedroom, and it felt too silly to call him for help, so I mustered the courage and made my way to his room. But the moment I left the bathroom, something roared at me. I screamed and wildly punched at the dark monster that had sprung from the gloomy, eerie hallway. "Ouch!" cried my boyfriend in dismay. "Oh my God, are you okay?" I asked him what was wrong. It was just my boyfriend trying to scare me. We both laughed as we got back into bed. But as we laughed about that prank and talked a little more, we suddenly heard footsteps from upstairs. We both paused and listened. After a few seconds, the footsteps stopped, and we agreed it was strange, probably from the downstairs apartment rather than the attic, or maybe we were just in denial. On another occasion, we had friends over. We were chatting when the topic of the paranormal came up. As we exchanged stories, we thought we heard footsteps from upstairs. Suddenly, the conversation died down, and we clearly heard footsteps moving across the living room ceiling into the hallway and towards the kitchen. Everyone was excited and eager to see the attic, so we went there only to find it empty. This event was so unsettling that I could barely sleep that night. About every week, we'd hear these footsteps clearly coming from the ceiling. It was terrifying. Every time I heard them, I immediately wanted to move out. I even stayed at a friend's house for a few days. Finally, my boyfriend decided to talk to his mother about the noises. Mrs. Miller, who called herself a medium, wanted to come over to feel the place. I didn't like the idea at all, but they agreed it was for the best. Then came the night I'll never forget. Mrs. Miller came over and walked around the entire apartment as well as the attic to get a sense of the place. She decided a seance would be best. I didn't like the idea at all, but I saw no way out. We all sat on the bedroom floor, surrounded by candlelight, as she asked the typical questions. "Who are you? What do you want?" Mrs. Miller began to tell us she was feeling a very dark presence when suddenly loud clanging and shattering glass could be heard from the kitchen. It was so loud I screamed and burst into tears. After the noise subsided, we all cautiously got up and went to the kitchen to find out what had happened. Our bedroom was right next to the kitchen, where a pantry was built into the wall. In the pantry we had a collection of glass bottles. The floor was so full of bottles that the trapdoor could barely be closed. Normally, the bottles stood so tightly that they couldn't fall over. But this time, all the bottles were scattered and several were broken. The pantry door was only partially closed. I stared in horror and exchanged a look with my boyfriend, who knew exactly what I was thinking. Then we all heard the footsteps on the ceiling again, moving down the hallway from the kitchen to the attic stairs. In a panic, I grabbed my purse and jacket and ran to Mrs. Miller's car outside. I felt like I was being watched the whole time. I tried to explain what had happened in the apartment with rational explanations, but nothing could convince me. A week later we moved out. Nowadays, I actively ignore anything paranormal and refuse to even have a Ouija board in my home. I believe there's an unseen world around us that we're better off staying away from. When my parents got married in the 80s, they didn't have much money, so their honeymoon consisted of a cheap road trip, sightseeing, and packed lunches. One of the places they visited was Eureka Springs, Arkansas. They fell in love with this pretty, historic town and enjoyed it so much that years later, they returned with their 2 children for a small family vacation. I was about 11 or 12, and my sister was 14. This was around the year 1999. This vacation was a little different from previous ones because my sister and I were supposed to get our own room at the hotel. That meant we wouldn't be disturbed by our parents, or kept awake by their loud snoring in the late hours. The hotel was decorated in a Victorian style, and the old wooden floors creaked with every step. I remember it felt like stepping back in time or acting in an old movie. We checked in and found that our parents' room wasn't right next to ours as we had all assumed, but up the stairs 2 doors down the hall. We thought it was no big deal and got our luggage to settle in. I admit, when my sister and I arrived in our room, we laughed about how creepy the place was. We were excited to discover a door to a balcony. However, when we opened it, we realized this wasn't such a good thing. The balcony connected to the adjacent room, which at our age felt a little spooky. After an afternoon of sightseeing and dinner, we returned to the hotel and retreated to our separate rooms. We showered and crawled into bed while I joked and talked with my sister. It was quite late, I'd say between 11 p.m. and midnight. We were tired and starting to doze off when suddenly, a soft, gentle knock came from the door. I looked at my sister, confused, and then we quickly realized it must have been Mom or Dad. Drowsily, I got up and went to the door to check. On the other side, I saw an old woman with white hair. I relayed the information to my sister, and when the knock came again she ran over, being a little silly, and shrugged. Then, in a softly crackling voice, she called out, "Yes?" Shortly after, we heard something about cookies. My sister decided to open the door. There stood a woman in a very old-fashioned, outdated maid's uniform, which fit the style of the hotel, as all the staff seemed to wear these antique clothes. She held a large, round tray full of cookies. The woman repeated, "I have freshly baked cookies if you'd like some," and gave us a kind smile. We told the woman, "No thanks," closed the door and went back to bed. We just thought it was strange and then fell asleep. In the middle of the night, I woke up because the bathroom light kept flickering. Not fast and continuous, but in regular, small intervals about every minute. I remember waking up several times and looking over at the window to see if there was a silhouette on the balcony. Several times, I had a very strange feeling of being watched. I didn't like that at all and didn't sleep well because of it. In the morning, my sister told me she had woken up during the night because the bathroom door slowly closed by itself. She hadn't noticed the flickering. I thought she was just unsettled by the encounter with the old woman and her imagination was playing tricks on her, while I assumed it was just an electrical problem that was no big deal. When our parents came down to get us for breakfast, we casually asked them if they had enjoyed their cookies the previous evening. They had no idea what we were talking about. We explained what had happened with the old lady, and they said no one had come by their room. We went downstairs to the hotel lobby, and on the way we noticed a flyer on the wall. It was promotional material for ghost tours. At the front desk, my father asked again about the cookies from the previous evening, jokingly saying he hadn't been offered any. The concierge gave us a strange look and explained that it wasn't a hotel service to bring freshly baked cookies to rooms at night. Something like that had never been done. We all found that very strange. Back home, we researched the Crescent Hotel where we had stayed and found out it is now known as America's most haunted hotel. Normally, I'm skeptical about such things, but I clearly remember that none of us had any prior knowledge that the hotel was haunted. So there were no preconceived notions about specters or the paranormal. I always wonder what would have happened if we had accepted that cookie. I had a small handful of strange occurrences happen to me at my old house when I was in middle school. My family moved into an old house on a small cul-de-sac on a country road. The previous owners were an elderly couple. They seemed reserved but kind. The 3-story house had the same matted red carpet and white walls in every room on every floor. More than half the light bulbs didn't work, and there was dust and cobwebs that hadn't seen a spider in ages. The basement didn't even have working lights, which led my parents to joke that the previous owners were vampires. The house, however, did feature a sauna that also hadn't been used in a long time. That room smelled of rainwater and damp wood, which I honestly found very calming. The house was situated on a few acres of land and was surrounded by woods, and our neighbors were quiet and kept to themselves. Even before we moved into this house, I had a bad feeling about it. I remember driving around town with my mom looking for a house, when we came across this small residential area. The moment we pulled up to the house, I felt a vibration emanating from it, not necessarily a bad feeling, but just something that felt off, as if this empty, neutral house was active in some way which is hard to describe. After we moved in, I told my mom about this and she had our pastor come over to pray about it, but it didn't do anything. It still felt eerie but not exactly terrifying. No big things ever happened, just strange occurrences. There were odd knocking sounds from the attic, which was only a small crawl space. They were peculiar thumping noises. I grew accustomed to these strange things and they quickly stopped bothering me. Sometimes I even found them exciting. After I graduated middle school, I got into some trouble and ended up being homeschooled. With those Christian schooling packets I had to work on by myself, so I taught myself and graded my papers since both my parents worked. Being alone at home during this time, in the middle of the woods, with a huge porch and surrounded by wildlife, you can imagine I spent a lot of time outside playing guitar and having fun. But coming from a strict family, no one knew I smoked except me, so I constantly had to be on guard in case my parents or sister came back. I could hear the garage door open from the upper room in the back. I was a pro at hiding my antics, but one thing that irritated me was the activity in that house. Multiple times, you could hear the garage door open and close, and you'd hear heavy footsteps coming up the stairs and entering the kitchen, distinctly audible. Sometimes, you'd hear the rustling of a bag or the jingle of keys, as if someone had come home from grocery shopping. This person would always go into the kitchen and just stand there. I'd stop what I was doing and call out to the person who had just come home. If I didn't get a response, I'd reluctantly get up and go downstairs. My parents liked to be sneaky, even though they weren't very good at it, but when I walked downstairs, constantly asking who was home, I'd enter the kitchen and see that no one was there but me. Then I'd search the whole house, including the garage, to see if the car was there, but it would be empty. This became a routine, and every time it happened, and it happened often, it didn't really scare me. I didn't feel anything menacing about it, though it did get annoying. As I got older, I concluded it must be an imprinted haunting, something that just repeated itself over and over. But there was one incident that truly scared me. One night, I was in the kitchen talking with my sister. Behind me were 3 large windows that looked out into our front yard. It was dark at the time, but I could still make out the tree in the front yard. Above the windows hung lights that shone onto a flower bed that was supposed to have flowers but was just dirt, so you could definitely see if anyone was in the garden. At some point during the conversation, we heard a loud, forceful knocking. Knock, knock, knock at the leftmost window. My sister and I both spun around as quickly as it happened, but we saw no one, just an empty yard and a swaying tree. We looked at each other and ran upstairs, laughing and shrieking. About a week after this incident, someone tried to break into one of our garages by kicking in one of the panels. The strange thing was that when my father went down to the garage, no one was there, and since we lived in a place where it would have been difficult to get away unnoticed, no one was nearby. Of course, they could have run into the woods and hidden, but there were absolutely no tracks, neither a car nor a bicycle, no footprints. The neighbors were also old, so not many kids lived nearby. I was never sure if that was related to the strange experiences or if it was just someone messing around. The only reason I suspect they were connected is how close they were in time. This is where my story ends. My family fell apart and I soon moved out of that house. I still drive past it occasionally. It was my favorite place growing up, and I hope the family living there now hasn't had any malicious experiences. I imagine they won't. The house never seemed to attract anything evil. Instead, it just had normal events imprinted and replayed, as if someone who used to live there hasn't quite realized they've moved on. This story isn't based on my own experiences but comes from my 8-year-old niece, Emma. A few days ago, Emma and I were hanging out and chatting in my room. I was asking her about how school was going and if she was still with a particular group of friends. But then the subject changed and she told me that one night she started hearing sounds in her room. I'm never the type to immediately assume something supernatural, so I started coming up with logical explanations to calm her down. Maybe some people on the street were just talking. But her demeanor immediately changed. She shook her head and said, "No, the voice was coming from inside my own room." She glared at me, without the slightest hint of the playfulness of our earlier conversation. I sat there for a moment before asking her more questions. Emma continued, reporting that this experience happened between late June and early July of 2018, so just a few months ago. Her exact words were, "It was late at night, and I was in bed trying to fall asleep when I heard a man start loudly talking to me. He sounded like he was sitting on the wall facing my bed. He sounded young, like a 17-year-old boy. He even said my name, telling me to wake up, but I was already wide awake, just sitting there trembling, pulling the bedsheet over my face. This guy was telling jokes, but they weren't funny jokes. They were creepy. He told me I was a bad girl and that I was going to burn down there." At this point, Emma's eyes started to tear up, and her chin trembled. It was completely clear to me that this wasn't a prank, and that she was deeply frightened. We are Christians and don't believe in ghosts in that sense, but I do believe in pure evil. My first thought was of a demon trying to scare or hurt my poor niece. Emma has had a tough time these past few years, already struggling with her self-worth, and that's despite her being only 8 years old. So I suspected a demon might have targeted her in her vulnerability to further oppress and destroy her. The thought of it made me furious. I hated whatever was in her room because it was scaring her. As her aunt, I didn't want to scare her further, so I told her it could be sleep paralysis, explaining that it happens to many people and is nothing unusual. That seemed to calm her down a bit and gave her a sense of security. She told me that day she felt like she was going crazy, and when she finally mustered the courage to run downstairs to her dad to sleep with him, the voice stopped and she was finally able to fall back asleep. I was the only one in the family she ever told this story to. When I asked her why she didn't report it to her parents, she simply replied, "I was scared they wouldn't believe me. Deep down, I don't believe it was just simple sleep paralysis. My gut tells me something evil was in that room because with sleep paralysis she wouldn't be able to move, and also, it lasted quite a long time. A full hour of this man mocking my niece." We ended our conversation with a few prayers, and I spoke some blessings over her. A few days later, I even went to her house to pray and bless her room. She said nothing has happened since, and I pray it stays that way. She's far too young to experience such horror. Before I begin, I want to mention that my wife and I don't drink, smoke, or use any other substances, so I can't attribute this to our imagination or hallucinations. A few years after we got married, we got a nice little house in a suburban area. We had always wanted a 3-bedroom, 2-bathroom house and found exactly that for a good price. When we asked why the price was so low, the seller said she didn't want to live there anymore. We didn't think much of it and looked at the house. It seemed almost as if it had been made just for us. We immediately signed the papers and secured the house, even though we were the only interested buyers, practically a guarantee. I had no idea that it would soon become clear why the price was so low and why no one else wanted to buy the house. A few perfectly normal months passed until one day, as I was watching ESPN and my wife was preparing lunch in the kitchen, I caught a black figure out of the corner of my eye on the wall. I watched it move up the stairs, accompanied by a faint creaking sound. Since I don't scare easily, I calmly said, "Honey, you didn't see that, did you?" She came in and asked what I was talking about. I told her about the shadow and she decided to go upstairs herself to check. A few minutes later, she came back and said she hadn't noticed anything. I shook my head and forgot about it. The following week, we were watching Saturday Night Live when I happened to look out the window and spotted 2 dark figures, smaller than the first one I'd seen. As I watched the 2 run in opposite directions, I hastily turned to my wife to tell her about it, but she was already staring out the window too. She asked if that was what I had seen that day and I nodded. We weren't really scared, maybe just a little unnerved. On another day, I hooked up my Xbox. After it started, I used a camera feature that detected heat in the environment. I saw a large figure standing right next to me, glowing red. At that moment, I thought that something so large and close could have harmed me if it had wanted to. Trembling, I said, "Excuse me, I'm live streaming with my friends right now. Could you please move aside immediately?" After that, I only saw my own image. A month passed without further incidents, but the shadows appeared more and more regularly. I saw them on the garage walls, on the truck, in my room, in the study, in the kitchen, in the basement, and even in the bathroom. One day, I'd had enough and called out, "What's your problem?" Of course, there was no answer, but I felt a cold chill. I turned around and saw a particularly large shadow, about 8 feet tall, pressed against the wall. I watched it point to the floor and then disappear. Curiosity overcame me and I looked at the spot it had pointed to. My wife and I decided to do some research and found out that, like many other haunted places, the house had been built on the site where a family once lived. A family with 5 children and a very large black caretaker named Randall. One night, a fire broke out in the kitchen, rapidly spreading throughout the house. Randall escaped, but all 7 other family members perished in it. A few days later, Randall was found lifeless among the charred remains of the house, with a head injury. He was so distraught that he took his own life. A few months passed until I spoke with some construction workers. As we cleared debris around the house, we found ash in roof tiles. I thought that was proof enough. I'm no archaeologist, but I'm no fool either. After a few more months, my wife said she'd had enough of that house. Although it was a nice place and offered everything we wanted, it was clearly not our home. In her eyes, it still belonged to the family who died there and everything surrounding them. We endured the shadows for another week, packed our belongings, and prepared to move. The house soon went back on the market and was quickly bought by another unsuspecting young couple. They also moved out after only a month. I never told them about these shadow people, but I think they got the message. A few days ago, I drove past the house and it's still empty. I think I know what was going on. The shadow people were the former family and their caretaker. They were lost, sad, and confused about what had happened to them, and I don't think any of them can bear to leave. We live in a new house now, and I notice a tiny shadow from the corner of my eye from time to time, but nothing remotely as significant as what I saw in that old house. The terror, the chilling realization of what shares a space with you, is something you never truly forget. If you've made it this far, Thank you so much for sharing this chilling journey with us on Haunted Screens. Every whisper, every shadow, every knock on the door. These stories remind us that the unexplained is closer than we think. If you've been haunted by these narratives and want to dive even deeper into the world of the paranormal, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the Haunted Screens channel. Hit the bell icon so you don't miss any of our upcoming videos, where we explore more terrifying tales and mysteries that defy logic. Comment below which story gave you the biggest shivers, or if you've had an unexplained experience yourself. Your story might be the next one we tell. Until our next dive into the shadows.